welcome to Fisher's Class Notes, Unit 1, Section 3, Episode 2. We talked about the French and Indian War in our last episode. Now we're going to look at the results and why that started some tension between the 13 colonies in Great Britain. Our vocabulary: French and Indian War, salutary neglect, Benjamin Franklin, customs duties, General Assembly, we'll talk a little bit about the Sons of Liberty, Proclamation of 1763, mercantilism, smuggling, Parliament, and the Stamp Act. By the end of this episode, I want you to understand 4 things. Number 1, the 13 colonies didn't actually get along with each other. The tensions unified them later, but at the time they didn't really trust each other. 2, American colonists were very proud to be Britain. They were proud to be British. The British Empire had just shown that they were stronger than France, stronger than Spain. They were the biggest, wealthiest empire in the world. They didn't want to pick a fight with them. They were proud British citizens. 3, Parliament did tax the colonists to pay for the war, and that's where the tensions start. And then 4, colonists didn't believe British Parliament had the right to directly tax colonists. They were fine with the customs duties. Remember, that's tax on export and importing goods, but they were not okay with directly taxing individual people. So, remember, Parliament, when we talk about Parliament, that's the British form of elected legislative body. Those are the elected officials. So not the king or queen, those that are elected to make the law. So when I talk about Parliament, that's what I'm talking about. It's similar to the legislative branch of our government, the House of Representatives and Congress. Okay, so let's get started. Remember, the 13 colonies were established to support the mercantilism of Great Britain, the giving Great Britain money by all the raw goods that they could export and import, buying cheap goods from England to export to the rest of the world and make a lot of money. The result, the colonists traded directly with Great Britain, or the mother country, and not with other countries. In fact, sometimes they weren't allowed to trade with other countries. They didn't even often trust people from Spain or France or things like that. Technically, Great Britain controlled trade, but until the French and the war, they pretty much let the American colonists do what they want. They were happy enough getting the money from the colonists, and they kind of let this sort of smuggling or illegal trading go on. So, like, the French and the colonists were fighting each other at the same time that they were illegally trading with each other. So the colonists were illegally trading with their mother country's enemy. All right, so the colonists were not happy when Great Britain decided to take more of a direct role in their governing lives. They liked the salutary neglect. They liked being kind of left alone. Remember, whenever the British government started doing things and getting more directly, like putting on more direct controls or stricter laws, you got rebellions. We talked about Culpeper's Rebellion. We talked about Carey's Rebellion. They preferred being left alone. They liked salutary neglect. The colonists wanted Great Britain to let only the General Assembly, the people that the colonists voted for, to tax them individually. But Great Britain needed to pay for the French and Indian War. France and Great Britain, remember, were fighting over the colonists that we talked about in our last episode. And that's what began the French and Indian War. But remember, there was also the fact that the colonists were fighting with all the American Indians because they kept trying to take tribal land from the different groups that we talked about. Also, remember in our last episode, Benjamin Franklin, he passed or proposed the Albany Plan of Union in 1754 for all the colonies to work together. And they originally said no to that. So it shows you how much they didn't really want to work together at first. In fact, Franklin was so frustrated that he said, "Everyone cries a union is necessary, but when they come to the matter of our form of it, their weak noodles are perfectly distracted," meaning when they're actually told, let's unify and work together, then they're too stupid to figure out that they need to do it. So the results of the French and Indian War, of course, was that Britain was in massive, massive debt. We looked at the numbers. They started before the war with 75 million pounds, and it almost doubled after the French and Indian War, after they fought with the French and the Spanish. So their solution, Britain would have to start taxing, the colonists would have to stop the smugglings to stop them from trading illegally with countries like France. like France, and that they were going to stop the colonists from moving further west so they wouldn't be fighting with the American Indians. So they levied direct taxes on the colonists like the Stamp Act. They put the British Proclamation of 1763 to stop the colonies from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains to keep peace with the American Indians. And they left a standing army of 10,000 British soldiers in the colonies to protect against attack. The colonists hated all three of those. They were really, really angry, and they wanted to go back to that system of solitary neglect. Number one, the colonists didn't think that Great Britain had the right to directly tax them. They thought that only the people they elected in their general assemblies were allowed to do that. So they were angry about that. They were also angry that Great Britain was cracking down or getting stricter about the smuggling. They thought, like, well, you're making money, we're making money, what's the problem? The more successful we are, the more money you make. And they were also angry about not being able to move further west past the Appalachian Mountains, because they thought, well, what's the whole point of fighting this war to get that land if you're not going to let us settle? And they were also really angry about the standing army, that they didn't see as protection, they saw it as a threat of, like, we're here to tell you what to do. Prime Minister Lord Grenville, he's the one who passed the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Sugar Act of 1764 were customs duties on things like sugar and coffee and things like that. And the Stamp Act of 1765, which was a direct internal tax on people on anything with paper. I'm talking about playing cards, deeds. So if you got married and you had to have it like a formal piece of paper, you had to pay a tax on that. And so it was a direct tax on all the colonists. And what they were mostly angry about when it came to these taxes, where they thought, you're allowed to tax our trade because you're in charge of our trade, but if you tax individual colonists, that's not fair because we are not represented in Parliament. And so they thought, well, you can't tax us if we have no representation. They basically thought their rights are being violated. Lord Grenville felt like, well, you are virtually represented because we have your interests in our interests, and so we're not going to do something unfair. Benjamin Franklin actually went to Great Britain, went to England, and argued in Parliament about how unfair it was, and we'll read that later. The colonists felt they weren't represented, they felt it was unfair, and they began, this kind of united them. Even though they didn't get along, this united them over their anger of the Stamp Act, and they decided to start working together to boycott and refuse to buy British goods. Here's actually a political cartoon of a bunch of women in Eatonton, North Carolina, so right in our home state, protesting against the Tea Act and refusing to drink British tea. All right, thanks for watching.